Good afternoon. My name is Millona. I'm the president and CEO of Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition and a proud co-chair of the National Partnership for New Americans. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you today to our session on global migration. Migration has always been a central part of our human history, not just here in the United States, but across the globe. Today's session will focus on what's notable about migration today, from threats that migrants face around the world, but also the opportunities they bring. I wanted to start with the opportunities of migration. Migration enriches our economy and our communities. Migration plays a huge role in the world economy, in the lives of migrants, in the communities where migrants are living and working, and for the families in place of origin. There are 272 million migrants worldwide, about 2/3 of which are migrant workers. Many migrants send remittances back home, which are essential, helping their families to put food on the table, to keep a roof over their heads, and send their children to school. In 2019, the amount of money that were sent by families, middle-income countries, reached $551 million US. This is more than the value of foreign direct investments to low and middle-income countries combined. Let's also consider why people migrate. Many do so to seek safety. The scale or force displacement within our migration system is significant. Nearly 8 million people worldwide have been displaced by violence, conflict, and persecution. That includes 26 million refugees who have fled across international borders and nearly 46 million internationally displaced persons who fled within their home country. More than 3/4 of refugees, about 15.7 million, are living in very difficult displacement situation. This refers to large groups of people who have been living in exile for the last 5 years. Migration is an opportunity to leave behind a dangerous situation in search for refuge. In the face of these opportunities, migrants also are facing severe threats. For example, migration has been forever changed by COVID-19 pandemic. Migrants already face significant barriers to their ability to flee threats, to access safety, and now it's even more difficult and complex. As of last October, there have been more than 96,000 movement restrictions put in place around the world. Migrants often rely on the informal economy to survive, and lockdowns have greatly impacted their ability to work and their ability to earn income. Furthermore, exclusion from key social safety nets have exacerbated health and economic impacts for an already at-risk population. Another threat to migration, which is not new, but is escalating rapidly, is the climate change. Climate change is increasing the intensity and frequency of sudden natural disasters, from hurricanes to floods to wildfires. This increases the likelihood of disaster displacements. More slowly emerging climate impacts like changing rainfall patterns, sea level rise, and lots of farmland or fresh water also affect people's ability to survive and contribute to migration and displacements, including rural to urban movement within countries. The World Bank projects that between 31 million and 143 million people in Africa, Asia, and Latin America will be displaced by climate change by the year 2050. Investing in local adaptation to climate change is crucial to minimizing the number of people impacted, so that displacement is at the lower ends of these projections. Stateless, it's also a significant problem. 10 million migrants worldwide are stateless, which means that they are not legally recognized as a national by any country. There are an estimated 200,000 stateless persons here in the United States. Without a recognized nationality, stateless persons face other challenges and threats, including arbitrary, prolonged, and repeated immigration detention. These are all global issues, and many of them are interconnected. But none of these issues can be addressed by any one country alone, nor by one or any movement alone. They raise further questions. What are the specific challenges that refugees and migrants face today in different parts of the world? How are the governments and the non-government organizations and grassroots networks responding to this? And how can we in the United States be a part of a global effort to ensure the safety, to ensure the dignity and the human rights of people on the move? So these are some of the questions that our speakers today will address. So to answer these questions, I am delighted to introduce our amazing panel today, starting with Erol, Kekic, then continuing with my colleague Neha Misra. Our next presenter will be Alma Maquitico and Sunil Varghese. Erol, please take it away.
Thank you, Eva, for that introduction. It is good to be with you today and with my fellow panelists. As you summarized, well, we are facing a perfect storm today. This global megatrend of displacement has also always been described as unprecedented in terms of the numbers. And in fact, just over the last 4 years, the number of forcibly displaced people went up from 65 or 66 million to almost 80 million at this point in time, with protracted high-intensity conflicts in Afghanistan and Syria and South Sudan, etc. And those with less mention in the news, perhaps, such as Somalia, Venezuela, Burma, and you name it, create a steady stream of displacement, both internally and externally. And perhaps the overused term of international community has simply run out of political will and therefore resources to deal with these crises, basically condemning a large number of people to years of suffering. And obviously the lack of US leadership over the last 4 years has been felt long and wide across the globe. The economically strong countries such as ours and some European countries have either pulled out of international organizations and covenants or declined to participate in any meaningful way, abandoning their own seat at the table and abdicating the historic leadership that they had in supporting the most vulnerable. And then, of course, we have the climate change, which further enhances displacement realities, with people unable to stay in their homes because of the floods, because of the droughts, because of the inability to grow food, because of the threat of conflict, etc. And then nativism and xenophobia have been manufactured and or harnessed in so many countries around the world, and ours has certainly led the way in that domain. Using rational fear of terrorism and then playing on economic swings, then creating a set of most radical policies in modern history was a favorite tool of chosen by the Trump administration to govern and to remain in power. Unfortunately, other countries did take notice and did some terrible policy work themselves, and that's the reality we face today. That's obviously led a severe damage to protection regime in the midst of the worst displacement crisis in recorded history. And of course, the global pandemic arrived just in time to make things even more complicated. It affected the US probably disproportionately, but it's felt robustly around the world. The pandemic affects the incomes and the protections of the most vulnerable displaced people directly and probably more so than others. It further exacerbates xenophobia and reinforces that our problem first approach and as well as the mindset. And this is just where the Biden-Harris administration starts. You asked about resettlement and complementary pathways. I am representing a national resettlement agency here today, so I hope I will not be taken out of context when I say that resettlement was never meant to be the solution to a refugee crisis. It's only ever been a small targeted tool offering direct protection to those for whom other solutions just weren't in sight. So I would offer two sets of opinions here, if I may. One that deal with the fact that we want to extend America's protection to refugees that need it and have to do it in the middle of global pandemic and a supercharged political environment. And the second one is that to get there, we have to take a rather realistic look, not just at the US infrastructure, which has been deliberately destroyed and dismantled over the last 4 years, but also take into account the state of the global architecture that undergirds the protection regime at large, and by extension, resettlement and complementary pathways. So, over the years, the process for choosing the perfect few that qualify for resettlement became much more bureaucratic and political, resulting in a new reality, if you will, where even in the best of times, the most vulnerable are not necessarily the ones that go into the pipeline in favor of, what one can describe as an easy lift, meaning that those refugees who just happen to be in the right place at the right time will be more likely to be resettled than those who are perhaps in more need of resettlement. Just to be clear here, one cannot compare miseries. That's not what I'm trying to do. But I am suggesting that in order to achieve a more empathetic and perhaps the right number of resettlement slots for the US, for example, we have to take a look at the global picture as well. So we have an opportunity to do that with the incoming administration that is expected to lead the process of not just building back, but building back better. And we need to take this chance. At CWS, we have recently published a paper on this topic, and I would refer everybody to our website who might be interested in reading it. We're also obviously very supportive of the next administration's proposal to increase the refugee admissions to 125,000. We must do so with vigor and probably also simultaneously be very cautious. The number that we're proposing cannot be static, and we need to allow for future global situation changes. That number needs to go up and down, perhaps, but it has to be in the neighborhood of 125,000. We also must make sure to be safeguarded against future attacks on the program, so we don't end up in the same situation that we were in for the last 4 years. And we have to do that both legislatively and publicly. So in a short run, we need executive actions to return the admission numbers to their historic norm of 95,000, and to reverse, obviously, the discriminatory travel bans. Those need to go immediately. But we also need a major investment in domestic capacity to conduct outreach and education to communities where resettlement is taking place, and the new locations where that hasn't just happened yet. We also need to make sure that there's a direct link between efforts on the public health side and those that place refugees to create clear messaging about refugee resettlement and to avoid any potential political conundrum that will be happening in the future. And lastly, one way to minimize swings is to consider multi-year commitments on funding and the numbers. This guarantees the minimal capacity and ensures the ongoing buildup of the program. He also asked about global compacts and global refugee forum. Maybe to just get a quick, better picture of why we have these compacts, we should probably just remind ourselves of the 2016 Global Summit convened by President Obama. What was true then is still true today, and that's the sheer size of the global displacement trend continues to require a global action, and by a multitude of actors. No country, no UN agency, no private sector can do it alone. Not doing anything by citing domestic priorities only makes the overall situation worse, and it's possibly the worst response that any one country can give, both from the moral fallacy of such approach, but also in terms of displacement, which is directly linked to global economy. If we understand all of that, then we understand how this communication, this messaging led to the process that created a framework for global compacts. So now, for the four past years, the US administration has pulled out of the Global Compact on migration, and I know some of my colleagues will talk about that. but they've also not participated in processes in and around Global Compact on Refugees in any meaningful way. And the same is true for the Global Refugee Forum, which is the tool to really bring the actors together to create financing necessary for the implementation of a Global Compact on Refugees. The U.S. basically offered no new pledges for 4 years and completely ceded and abdicated its leadership role, basically giving other countries a carte blanche to do nothing as well. So the Biden-Harris administration must take the U.S. presence seriously, must make that presence felt by the Global Refugee Forum, by making commitments to resettle more refugees, which is what we want, but also equally important to offer significant financial support to refugee hosting countries. And this action has to serve as a first step for the U.S. to reclaim its rightful leadership in the international community. And of course, they also need to rejoin the Global Compact on Migration, as well as the high-level panel on internal displacement, despite what will inevitably be a pushback from political parties and members of Congress and their constituencies, etc. We all know the global compacts are not perfect by any stretch of imagination, but they're the best we have in organizing global forces to help us look for solutions to this global migration crisis. So, Global Refugee Forum, while full of flaws and definitely not perfect, has had some successes, even without any U.S. support. And UNHCR, for example, has raised about $500 million in private sector pledges to its operation there. That's a pretty significant amount of money, but obviously a drop in a bucket. But imagine what could happen if we had the U.S. at the table. And then, of course, you had this global pandemic situation on top of all of that, as you mentioned earlier. And going beyond this crisis will be hard, even with the vaccine, even if it's available tomorrow. COVID is and will be used as a political tool by some, unfortunately, and the new administration here will have to deal with that. But our community has a more difficult task, which is to deal with that fact at the local level here in the U.S. as we continue to try to resettle refugees. What's also hard is to getting two refugees overseas who happen to be in refugee camps that are off limits at this point in time because of COVID-19 and travel restrictions. So to rebuild the pipeline, to move people from point A to point B, to put them on planes to come to the US, and then to integrate them here in the middle of the global pandemic and uncertain political reality will be certainly a challenge. But I know one thing, and we've been waiting for this moment for 4 years, and we're ready to go ahead and do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erol, for your insights. Very much appreciated. Neha, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Eva, and thank you everyone for having me here today. I'm going to build a little bit on what Erol's already spoken about by starting to talk about the Global Compact for Migration process and how it came about and what the impact of the pandemic on migrants, how the Global Compact implementation is helping or hurting that process. So just to start, as Erol was saying, the Global Compact for Migration came out of the New York Declaration process in 2016. And as many people remember, in 2016, we had a different government in the United States. It was still the Obama administration. And they were taking a leading role in the New York Declaration in the process that was going on at that time. They actually had a one-day summit around refugee issues and were playing a very active role in the process. The New York Declaration process came out of the recognition that we are facing one of the largest movements of people in human history, that we've seen extremely large numbers of refugees and internally displaced people, as Erol was talking about, but also very large movements of economic migrants. Some of the largest that we're seeing ever in human history. And this includes both documented and undocumented migrants who were crossing borders in search of work. So the New York Declaration was created to basically address those issues. And as part of the New York Declaration in 2016, the UN agreed that it would negotiate two global compacts, as Erol mentioned, the Global Compact for Refugees and a Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. I say the full title of the Global Compact for Migration, Safe, Orderly, and Regular, because I think it's very telling, the title itself, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Many of us were a little disappointed to see the two compacts separated from each other because, as we all know, of course, there's issues of mixed flows of migrants, and there's many issues about migration governance that are really important in both compacts. I do understand a lot of the reasons about why they were separated. I just think it's important to note that the fact that there were two means that we have those of us who are working on implementation of both compacts need to ensure that there's coherence and complementarity between the two. So as I mentioned, the Global Compact for Migration idea came out in 2016 when we still had an Obama administration in the United States. The actual negotiations, however, started when there was not just a new government and administration in the United States, but several new governments around the world. And in fact, during the negotiation process of the Global Compact for Migration, we started to see rising authoritarianism around the world and rising scapegoating of migrants in a lot of ways. And this is really important because at the beginning of the process of the Global Compact for Migration negotiations, it was led by the governments of Switzerland and Mexico. And the first draft of it was actually really good. The Solidarity Center was part of a larger labor movement coalition that worked on ensuring that labor rights for migrants were incorporated into the Global Compact for Migration. And we saw in the zero draft, as it's called, the first draft of it, that many of the provisions that we were advocating for were actually in the zero draft. However, the Global Compact was negotiated over a 6-month period. And again, during that time, we saw a change in government in a lot of countries, including the United States, but in other places such as Brazil, and some places in Europe, for example. And we started to see a tightening of the rights framework of the Global Compact for Migration. With that said, in the end, we still believe that it's a really important document, that it has a lot of really useful provisions in it. And it's a non-binding document, so we see it as a guide that could be used to help governments think about how to deal with migration governance better. As the pandemic hit, and as we're in the process of the process that the UN Migration Network is now calling the Implementation, Follow-up, and Review, or I4 process of the Global Compact, the pandemic has hit, and it's giving us a time to reflect how the Global Compact can be useful in addressing what's happening during the pandemic to migrants and some of its shortcomings. The pandemic has shown us nothing new. What I keep saying to people in the labor migration world and in terms of economic migrants and migrant workers, the pandemic is not revealing anything new or things that we didn't know before, or that any of us who work on migration that we didn't know were shortcomings to migration management or migration government schemes. But the pandemic is exacerbating them, and hopefully in a way that's putting it front and center so that the issues that many of us have been advocating for years to get addressed will actually be addressed, because more people are seeing the failures of migration governance systems and seeing how there still is a lack of protections for migrant workers. So, for example, with the pandemic, we're seeing globally around the world, in the United States, but also in pretty much any country where you have migrant workers, that migrants are getting a really hard hit from the pandemic. One of the first things that we saw is that there's a failure in regular migration programs, valid visa programs around the world. There's a failure because migrant workers are typically excluded from social safety net protections through these migration programs around the world. So it's not just undocumented migrants, but it's also migrants who come in through regular migration programs in the United States, any of our non-immigrant work visa programs, the guest worker programs, the kafala system programs we know in the GCC, the seasonal agricultural worker programs in Canada, all of those regular migration programs. In them, many migrant workers are explicitly excluded from things like Social Security protection, unemployment insurance, health insurance, or medical care. And so when the pandemic hit and governments put in place any sort of safety net protections, whether it was income stimulus, increased unemployment insurance, or other things that would normally catch people during times of crisis, migrant workers fell through the cracks because they were not covered by these protections. And again, it's really important to remember that a lot of this was explicitly done way before the pandemic. And so around the world, including in the United States, we've seen migrant workers being laid off and fired overnight. Wage theft, which again has always been an issue for migrants, we're seeing exponentially become even more of an issue, where migrants are not getting their owed wages and benefits as they're being laid off and fired. We're seeing workers being thrown out of employer-sponsored housing and being forced to live in the streets. We're seeing workers being stuck and not being able to go home, even when they want to, with voluntary repatriation, because airports have been closed or they were not given support to get a ticket to come home. All of these things are hitting migrant workers really strongly. We work with a lot of migrant workers in many countries around the world. My organization, the Solidarity Center, has offices in over 30 countries around the world and works in over 60 countries. And we've heard story after story of workers, migrant workers, not eating for days or weeks at a time because they've lost their wages, their income. And again, there's no social safety net support for them. The Global Compact can play a role in addressing some of these challenges. There are different objectives and provisions within the Global Compact that do talk about things such as Social Security benefits, that do talk about access to services, whether that's healthcare, medical care, legal aid for labor violations like wage theft that I've just talked about. There are things within the Global Compact that could address this. We just need states to step up and do more and recognize this. There are some states that have done some things to address this vulnerability that I'm talking about for migrant workers related to the pandemic. For example, countries such as Italy and Portugal have given temporary status to undocumented migrant workers so that they can stay in country. Now, while this sounds good on paper and when you first hear about it, it is a good thing in the short term. Unfortunately, a lot of these short-term temporary stays that are giving to migrant workers are not because governments are concerned about migrants, getting care and being safe from the pandemic, but in fact, what we're seeing is they're doing it so that they have the migrant workers to stay and plant the crops, pick the crops, provide all of those essential services that we all know we all need right now during the pandemic, and that migrant workers are filling. A lot of these states are giving this special status to undocumented migrants so that they can stay to provide those essential services. At the same time, though, they're not coming with increased rights. So we're seeing workers who are given visas to stay in that country and yet aren't given workplace rights so that they can demand personal protection equipment, occupational safety and health equipment, so that they can make sure that they're protected while they're planting and picking the food and making the food and delivering the food and taking care of all of us during the pandemic. We're not seeing increased protections. Again, the Global Compact for Migration has provisions in it that could help with that. One of the things that one of the reasons why we've been big fans of the Global Compact for migration is because it presents the idea of dealing with global migration governance. And I say governance, not management, because the word governance implies rights, where I think the word management doesn't necessarily. So the Global Compact brought back the idea of multilateralism on migration governance, and that's so important. We've seen too much in our work as Solidarity Center where countries of origin who tend to have weaker bargaining power, when they try to negotiate bilateral agreements or other protections in destination countries for migrant workers, they're often not able to negotiate strong agreements because of their weak bargaining power. When we approach things from a multilateral perspective, and when we have a normative frameworks of rights at the center of that, it makes it easier to ensure that we have a good floor for migrants in their workplaces and in their communities, et cetera, in destination countries. And that's what the Global Compact does. Erol mentioned in his presentation that the U.S. government pulled out a lot of these processes. And as I was talking about the Global Compact for Migration, the Trump administration did pull out of the process pretty early on before the negotiations started. There is a lot of hope now with the Biden-Harris administration that they will come back into the United Nations processes and into the implementation process for the Global Compact. And so we're really excited and looking forward to that, because it is really important, as Erol was saying, for the United States to play, excuse me, for the United States to play a leadership role and to push other governments to also engage in multilateralism. And we're really hopeful about that. My hope, and just in conclusion, I'll say that my hope is that the Global Compact and the processes that are going on right now, and so what's happening with the Global Compact for migration is that there's a series of regional reviews going on right now where governments regionally can look at how they're implementing the Global Compact. My hope is, as I was saying at the beginning, that we'll take kind of this pandemic lens that has been put on everything and recognize that the failure, how we have failed migrant workers in the United States and globally when it comes to the pandemic, it shines a light on the fact that we are failing them for decades and years, and that it's about the systems, structures, and institutions that we've created, these temporary migration programs that we've relied on that are inherently abusive of worker rights, that don't allow workers to migrate with their own families, don't allow them to express their workplace rights, don't allow them to change employers, etc., requires them to pay huge recruitment fees, that all of that has failed migrant workers, and that we need to come up with a new system that treats all workers the same, whether they're migrants or even whether they're refugees. We have to include refugees within that. As they get rights to work, refugees also should have rights at work. And as we're have that lens focused on this, I'm hoping in the Global Compact implementation that states will start to think about, how do we make real change, and not just little things, and not just try to get migrant workers back to destination countries so we can get the billions of dollars in remittances into countries, but how do we make the process more fair, create decent work for all? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Neha, for your thoughtful remarks. I am going to turn it over now to Alma. Alma, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eva. I'm very glad to be here. And as my colleagues already mentioned, in the last few years, we have been witnessing the largest waves of forced migration in nearly a century, with large numbers of people coming from Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, making the journey through Europe, the Aegean Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and Southeast Europe. In the US, our attention has been primarily focused on the flow of unauthorized migrants coming from Mexico, Central America, and South America, with many of them arriving to the US southern border. But I think before we discuss some of the fundamental gaps and protections that we need to be pushing for and that we need to be addressing, I think it's very important to talk about the root causes or the drivers of migration. Root causes are the conditions that really push people to migrate. In our experience, some of these include land grabbing, displacement, environmental degradation as a result of large-scale agro-industries and other resource extractive businesses coming into indigenous communities, indigenous territories, and causing, massive displacement and loss of land. Some other communities are escaping human rights abuses or political violence. Others are responding to unemployment pressures or contemporary labor dynamics. Increasingly, millions of people are also pushed to leave their homes because of climate change. The World Bank has estimated that 3 regions of the world, which are Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia, will generate 143 million of migrants by 2050. Communities increasingly displaced by climate change are displaced by sudden onset, sudden disasters, whether these are typhoons, hurricanes, wildfires, but they're also increasingly displaced by other natural disasters that are a little bit more slow on the onset. And this include desertification, deforestation, rising temperatures, or sea levels. In Latin America, for example, scientists have noticed that For the fifth consecutive year, erratic weather patterns have prolonged the dry spells in the dry corridor of Central America, which are leaving farmers and rural communities very prone to hunger, malnutrition, and displacement. And of course, in these situations, children are especially vulnerable. These type of migrants are migrants that are not necessarily considered refugees, and there's no protections for this type of migration. So this is something that we as civil society need to be paying attention and need to figure out ways of pushing governments, not only our government, but governments around the world, to pass an international protection strategies for migrants that are fleeing as a result of climate change and environmental degradation. But in the last decades, instead of addressing these contemporary mobility challenges, governments have been increasingly hardening their borders to address these migration and mobility challenges. At land, around the sea, and air borders around the world, migrants are increasingly experiencing discrimination, violence, and many forms of rights violations. This includes arbitrary detentions at ports of entry, where border agents have an enormous amount of discretion to allow or not to allow people to come into the country and to decide who has a valid claim. So migrants and refugees face like a systematic challenge and discrimination at borders, and often face violence and dangerous interception practices, which include, chases, which includes many policies that push migrants to migrate not only through the ports of entry because there's no legal paths, but also through the militarization and the hardening of borders. Migrants are increasingly funneled into areas that are remote and desolated areas such as deserts, and many of them are dying as a result of policies. This in the US has resulted in 10,700 documented deaths at the gates of our nation. And local community organizations believe that there's at least 2 bodies that have not been found for each body that they have documented. So this is creating an enormous human rights and humanitarian catastrophe at our gates. And this is something that we really need to ask the Biden administration, to demand the Biden administration to address. We cannot allow people to continue dying, and people who are fleeing as a result of violence and climate change and environmental degradation to be criminalized, to be punished, and to be actually pushed towards deadly situations. Migrant children are also some of the people that have been tremendously impacted by this, the hardening of borders and this lack of protections. This is contrary to international human rights standards, especially on the rights of the child, that state that under no circumstances children should be detained or separated from their families. Contrary to common belief, migrant children and families did not start to be detained under the Trump administration. About five years ago, the Obama administration began a process of very aggressive deterrence strategy, which led to the prolonged detention of about 1,000 children and mothers who were locked up for the first time in family detention centers. By the time the Trump administration arrived, around 2017, The administration ramped up the number of families in detention to more than 100,000, with more than 5,000 children being forcibly separated from their families at the border. Other challenges that we have seen around the world as a result of the hardening of borders is increasingly the challenge and the undermining of the asylum process. Here on the US-Mexico border, we saw that through the migrant protection protocols, with push between 60,000 and 72,000 people to remain in Mexico to wait for their asylum hearings. This pushed many asylum seekers to situations of violence, kidnapping, and many other violent situations in Mexico. It also put them at risk of health risk, increasingly by pushing them to overcrowded shelters and overcrowded refugee camps. Since the COVID pandemic, the situation even became more aggravated as governments around the world and our government push for really legally dubious and hardline immigration policies that cannot be justified under the public health concerns. This included the closures of the border, the travel bans, the expedited deportations, and many times these expedited deportations happen without due process and without taking the necessary considerations to protect migrants, to protect workers, and to protect people in other countries from COVID. As a result of the pandemic, many of the people that were pushed to remain in Mexico are still waiting in Mexico to wait for their cases. People calculate about 20,000 asylum seekers waiting still on refugee camps and overcrowded shelters, waiting for their asylum claims. In recent weeks, we heard about many children still being separated from their families, and their parents have not been able to be found. Many of the lawyers here on the US-Mexico border believe that this happened also as a result of parents being faced with the difficult and tragic decision of protecting their children and sending them, walking them to the port of entry and sending them as unaccompanied minors to protect them from the hardships they were experiencing on migrant camps or shelters. And some of these parents have not been found anymore. Some may have returned to their home countries or may have been deported in some way, or some may have entered or tried to enter the US without inspection, and some may have perished on the way, on their attempt. Additionally, the US has deported thousands of people in hundreds of deportation flights from the US to Latin America and the Caribbean since February. They have done so without following proper public health protocols, and some countries in Latin America have mentioned this, that the increase of COVID numbers have been the result of these deportation flights. We believe that despite the extraordinary circumstances presented by the pandemic, and despite the contemporary pressures and challenges in terms of migration and human mobility, we believe that governments can do a lot to protect people from perishing and from suffering unnecessarily in their process of mobility. So we urge the US government to re-engage in multilateral dialogues and negotiations to address these mobility challenges. The first thing we believe that needs to happen is that we as civil society, as community organizations, as people of conscience, we have to push our government to dismantle the system of deterrence and to abandon hardening the borders through walls, barriers, militarization in favor of border governance that protects fundamentally and is grounded in basic human rights. Human rights should strengthen the rule of law and protect people and communities. And it's also, human rights can be or should be the basis for building and rebuilding our democracy. We also believe that governments have to come together and to figure out how to address contemporary mobility challenges and these fundamental and crucial gaps that exist in the protection agenda. This means figuring out how to protect migrants on the move who are fleeing as a result of climate change, and how to create legal pathways to address contemporary labor dynamics. But these legal pathways must be grounded in human rights and must include all human rights, constitutional rights, civil rights, and the right to residency should a person decides to stay in our country. We also urge governments, our government and governments around the world, to prioritize the protection and the recognition of the right to refuge, and to push and pass robust protections for children. We know that the US, as my colleagues mentioned, has not been engaged in the process of the Global Compact, but we believe there is an opening with this new administration, and at least there is an opening for us as civil society to mobilize support around the Global Compact, but also to mobilize support for fundamental human rights and to reject the criminalization of migrants and poor people on the move. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alma, for those thoughtful remarks and for all that you do. I would like at this time to turn it over to Sunil Varghese, the Policy Director for the International Refugee Assistance Project. Sunil, please take it away.
Thank you, Eva, and thank you to the panelists before me and to the host for this opportunity. I wanted to speak to you briefly about the impact of the coronavirus on refugee communities and the global response before the pandemic and going forward. So first, just to address, as you all know, refugees often are hosted in conditions where they are ripe already as vulnerable people for the pandemic, for the coronavirus to have a terrible impact. Oftentimes, refugees are hosted in regions where health systems are overwhelmed or undercapacitated. Oftentimes, refugee camps are overcrowded. Shelters are makeshift. Oftentimes, there's inadequate access to health services, clean water, soap, and sanitation. So there is this fear, and there was this fear from the very beginning that the coronavirus would tear through refugee communities even worse than it has across the world. Moreover, the quarantine has really caused situations that acutely affect refugee communities. We've seen an increase in gender-based violence, including intimate partner violence, trafficking, sexual exploitation, and child marriages. There's one estimate reported by some experts that in April, they said in April that in every 3 months that we were locked down around the world, an additional 15 million women and girls would be exposed to gender-based violence. In addition, that lockdown and that kind of isolation has kind of shown a really acute need for mental health assistance in refugee communities. We also see severe economic vulnerability. Per the World Bank, the coronavirus may push 115 million people back into poverty. You see a lack of employment opportunities for refugees that are in urban settings. Supply chains are leading to food shortages. So I say all this to kind of lay the case, or just to set the scene, that the coronavirus is really going to have a disproportionate impact on an already vulnerable population. So I think the last estimate that I saw from UN High Commissioner for Refugees is that there are about 32,000 cases of the coronavirus amongst forcibly displaced people. And that is actually fewer cases perhaps than were expected. But unfortunately, like the United States, the cases are really on the rise as of late. Oftentimes, the number of cases is attributed to the relative isolation of refugee populations, and we see this in having a very kind of terrible impact, in that oftentimes it is difficult for service providers and human rights advocates to reach populations that are isolated. But it is the case that it seems the number of coronavirus cases amongst refugee communities is increasing, and is increasing a bit frightening at a frightening pace. So what is to be done? I think the solution to this specific point is what we've seen kind of organizations like UNHCR do in the outset of the pandemic, which was spring into action and prepare social safety nets and support services for refugee communities that really, through the provision of incredible amount of resources to protect those communities from rampant spread. But also, I think there needs to be, and there should be more coordination within the domestic hosting countries, that social safety nets and support services that are enacted for COVID, for the coronavirus, include integration of refugees, refugee-led organizations, their needs, their skills and knowledges in the humanitarian response. An example of that, I think, is, for example, in Canada, Canada announced during the pandemic that they would open pathways for a number of asylum seekers to receive permanent residency, who are working in the healthcare sector and are on the front lines of Canada's COVID-19 response. That's an example of integrating refugees and asylum seekers into that country's COVID-19 response. Same in the US context. We've kind of seen an absence on a federal level of COVID-19 packages, including the needs of refugees and asylum seekers. And instead, we're looking at states and localities to provide assistance where the federal government is not. And I think one of the main issues that refugee advocates in the United States are pushing for is inclusion of the needs of refugees and asylum seekers in the provision of aid and social services in the US COVID-19 packages to come. Now, another point is that coronavirus has disrupted durable solutions, making it impossible to either return home, integrate locally, or have refugees resettle in a third country, or refugee resettlement. And according to the UNHCR, 2020 will be a record low, the lowest number in decades for refugee resettlement. According to the latest data, only a little bit more than 15,000 refugees were resettled from January 2020 to the end of September this year. Last year, in that same period, over 50,000 refugees were resettled. In the United States, in fiscal year 2020, which ended September 3rd, at the end of September 2020, only 11,814 refugees were resettled, and that's an all-time low. Because this is somewhat not surprising, because there are limits on mobility and travel restrictions. But it is important to note that even in the United States, resettlement is happening. People are traveling, and that countries have found a way for refugees to continue to be resettled, but keeping both refugees and the communities at their destination communities safe. So that's, I think, an important point. Like, resettlement is happening globally, the freeze on refugee travel, at least the one from UNHCR and IOM, was enacted in March, but was lifted in June. So since June and to date, we are seeing refugees being resettled safely, and I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, that we don't know how long the pandemic will last. We don't know if this is the first of others, and we don't know how long we'll be on lockdown. But it doesn't mean that refugee resettlement can't happen safely. Of course, we won't get to the same kind of numbers as if there were no travel restrictions, but we can address emergency situations. For example, I'll give you an example. Like after the explosions in Lebanon, the community was able to expedite the departures of over 1,000 refugees who were, affected by that devastating explosion at the port. And refugees were able to travel to 9 resettlement countries in just August and September from Lebanon. And that's because the international community has been able to allow this resettlement to proceed safely. And so I think that's just an important note. And I think what we need, the lesson learned from there is that through coordination of governments and NGOs, it's possible for a country to protect the public health of its citizens, but also to ensure access to its territory for forcibly displaced people. And that's just something that we really need to kind of pay heed to and continue to advocate. It can't be done by the international community alone, or by NGOs alone, or by states alone, but protecting public health does not mean that forcibly displaced people have to be excluded. And unfortunately, it'll just take me to my third and last point. That is kind of what we've seen, at least at the outset of the pandemic, that in the name of public health, countries were closing borders. According to the UNHCR, at the height of the pandemic, 168 countries fully or partially closed their borders, with at least 90 making no exception for people seeking asylum. And we're seeing that in the United States as well. The Center for Disease Control, CDC, enacted a ban on travel from cross-border travel that made no exception for asylum seekers or even unaccompanied alien children. And it's not just a lack of access to the country and the domestic asylum system, but we're seeing kind of even the worst things. There's actual refoulement, or some countries or some situations where asylum seekers are returned to their country of origin. There is sometimes a disproportionate or punitive use of immigration detention and removals and flights, where the safer alternative would be to not use immigration detention in a punitive fashion. We've seen from the beginning denying the disembarkation of boats carrying asylum seekers in the Mediterranean or the Andaman Sea, really causing just terrible humanitarian consequences and being completely the opposite of customary international law. We're also seeing countries trying to outsource their domestic asylum processes to other countries who might be forced to take that burden. So, on one side, we see that refugee resettlement can happen safely, and that you don't need to threaten, or you don't need to risk public health by continuing refugee resettlement. And my third and last point is that I think that same is true for domestic asylum seekers, that you can ensure access to a domestic asylum system safely without sacrificing public health. And there are, at least 27 countries without COVID-related migration restrictions as of now, 77 countries where there are restrictions, but there are exceptions for asylum seekers. There are over 100 countries where there are creative ways to enable asylum processing, like through remote interviews and other remote processing technologies. And so, I think that unfortunately the United States and dozens of other countries are denying access to the domestic asylum system. But I think that through this kind of global coordination at the border and within, with coordination with NGOs, the international community, and domestic governments, that we can protect public health, but still allow for the most vulnerable, forcibly displaced people to access the protection mechanisms that are already in place. So that's kind of just my initial thoughts on this kind of global coordination, and what can be done going forward in the pandemic, and how we can preserve existing humanitarian protection measures while at the same time balancing the needs of public health. And thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Sunil. And I just wanted to say this has been such an amazing and very rich discussion. So thank you so much to our amazing panel, Erol, Neha, Alma, and Sunil. It was a pleasure being with you today. I know that I speak on behalf of so many that I really wanted to thank all of you for your comments and for supporting and uplifting immigrant and refugee families. So my deepest gratitude. And to our attendees, I just wanted to say that I am really grateful for your attendance, for the great work that you do. As I mentioned at the beginning of the session, migration has always been part of human history. It's not going away, but there are significant threats that migrants are facing today, and things will continue to worsen if the global community doesn't respond and we do not work together. So there is a lot of work to be done, my friends. Migration makes us all stronger. Our community, migration makes us all stronger. Our economy and our communities will get much stronger. Any negative impacts to migration will affect us all. All people should be free to migrate as they desire. It's our responsibility to ensure that they can do so safely. So I look forward to working with all of you in the years to come. Thank you again for being part of our panel. Thank you so much for your presence, the amazing work that you do, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you so very much.